The first Olympic football tournament was played at the 1900 Paris Games. 30 years later, the inaugural FIFA World Cup unfolded in Uruguay. Right now, and for the vast majority of the history of international football, winning a World Cup title is the greatest honor the sport has to offer. There are many reasons for this, the primary one being that football at the Olympics essentially is a youth tournament due to the age restriction. But has it always been like this? Has there ever been an Olympic football tournament that could just as well be regarded as a World Cup? An example of this being the case is in women's football, where the Olympics are widely regarded to be on par with the World Cup when it comes to status and importance. So there's no reason to inherently believe that that has never been the case in the men's game. Step 1 of this examination is to find eligible candidates. Specifically, Olympic tournaments that are potentially equal to the World Cup. Keyword potentially. For an Olympic tournament to be regarded as an eligible candidate, it must meet the following arbitrary requirements invented in this video. Have at least 13 teams, and have at least 3 non-European teams, preferably from different confederations. Along with those straightforward demands, there are 2 more complicated ones. One that I will refer to as the Eastern Bloc exploit in this video. It boils down to that many Eastern Bloc states exploited the amateur rule at the World Cup by sending players who were professional in all but name, giving them an unfair advantage. Olympics that have seen that exploit used, such as the Munich 1972 games among others, are ineligible. The final requirement relates to amateurism. Generally, the World Cup has professional players, whereas the Olympics often have amateurs, or at least people younger than a certain age in these most recent tournaments, especially historically. However, all Olympics with amateur players still can't be instantly disregarded as candidates, because there are actually World Cups that have had several amateurs, particularly really early tournaments. But at the same time, more recent World Cups are almost exclusively professional, meaning it would be wrong to not disregard those contemporary Olympics as candidates. In other words, we must decide on a year when it stops being acceptable for an Olympic tournament to have mostly amateur players for the sake of this examination. To determine that year, I first listed all countries with a professional league. Next, I sorted them according to the year the leagues became professional. In total, there were 78 countries and leagues. Country 39, the median, was chosen as the limit between when amateur squads would be permitted at the Olympics for this examination. That country was Denmark, whose league was professionalized in 1978. As a result, the 1980 Olympics and beyond are ineligible according to this restriction. There are several ways to go about this, and nothing is really right or wrong. This is just how I did it. It's also likely that some of the years of professionalization are incorrect. Still, they're likely wrong in both directions, so to speak, meaning the discrepancies probably even out in the end. Regardless, this examination is mostly for fun and isn't meant to be 100% scientific. Applying those 4 criteria leaves these 7 Olympic football tournaments as eligible candidates. However, there's also a final bonus criteria, general strength, meaning a tournament should be disqualified if too many strong football nations are missing. It's quite a subjective requirement, so I didn't want to include it as an official one. Still, as I reached the 1968 tournament of this examination, I realized it's not as strong as the other Olympic football tournaments examined in this video, yet none of the other requirements eliminates it. TLDR, the 1968 Mexico City Games are also ineligible. Let's examine the rest in chronological order, naturally beginning with the 1924 Paris Olympics, which were won by Uruguay. One of the 2 eligible Olympics that actually occurred prior to the inception of the World Cup. This makes it particularly interesting, and increases its chances of being regarded as equal to the World Cup, since the benchmark wasn't really set yet. As the tournament fulfills all our criteria, it's fair to consider it on par with a World Cup title. A fact further amplified by Uruguay defeating strong nations to secure the title: Yugoslavia, the United States, France, the Netherlands, and Switzerland. Even though, for example, France and the Netherlands weren't world powers as they are now, they were still solid. If that wasn't enough, Uruguay were reigning South American champions at the time, and a big portion of that squad also featured at the 1924 Olympics. it's definitely fair to consider Uruguay an unofficial world champion of that year. The 1928 Olympics are eerily similar, with Uruguay winning the title as reigning South American champions, after defeating several strong nations. Again, it's fair to consider Uruguay unofficial world champions of 1928. It's incredible how little Uruguay would have 4 World Cup titles, the same as Germany and Italy, and only being eclipsed by Brazil. Furthermore, Uruguay would possess the unparalleled record of having participated in 4 finals without losing any. The next candidate is the elephant in the room, the 1936 Olympics hosted by Nazi Germany. It was the first Olympic football tournament since the inception of the World Cup. You could argue it should be disqualified from contention due to being organized by a dictatorship, but unfortunately there are such regimes that have hosted World Cups, so it would be incorrect to eliminate the 1936 Olympics on those grounds. From this tournament onward, competing nations would only be permitted to play their best players if those players were amateur, or where professional players were state-sponsored. However, amateur players were still counted as senior squad players until 1992, meaning this tournament can't be disqualified as a candidate because of that. Nevertheless, Italy won the tournament against an Austrian team that arguably shouldn't even be in the final to begin with, as they had been awarded a win against Peru due to a pitch invasion, despite the Peruvians scoring more goals, which is just unparalleled at a World Cup. Who knows how the tournament would have unfolded had that not happened? It's possible Italy would have won it regardless, but that dubiously awarded win makes it impossible to consider these Olympics on par with the World Cup. As a result, Italy's triumph at these Olympics will not be regarded as an unofficial World Cup title. Still, as the Italians won the 1938 and 38 World Cups, albeit quite controversially, they're probably not too distraught. There are real World Cup matches that have been extremely controversial and possibly blatantly rigged, but disregarding actual scorelines is where I draw the line. Next, we have the first Olympics after World War II, the 1948 London Games. You could argue it's an ineligible candidate since so much of the world, especially Europe, laid in ruins following the war. However, since countries like Yugoslavia, Great Britain, France and the Netherlands participated despite suffering immensely in the war, it's not a valid point in my opinion, especially since the same argument could be made about the 1950 World Cup. It's simply a bit of a non-argument. When it comes to the Olympic football tournament itself, Sweden won it after defeating a strong Yugoslavia 3-1 in the final. In fact, the Yugoslavs actually eliminated host Great Britain in the semi-final, while Sweden beat Austria, South Korea and eventual bronze medalists Denmark, en route to the final. Sweden won gold largely thanks to an exceptional trio known as Grenoli, consisting of Gunnar Gren, Gunnar Nordahl and Nils Lidholm, that would all later become Serie A legends. As the tournament fulfills all of the requirements and doesn't feature any major dubious activity, it's fair to regard it as equal to a World Cup title. Another thing that helps Sweden's case is that they finished third at the 1950 World Cup, despite not being allowed to use any of their Serie A players. Also, I made a video examining who would have won the lost 1946 World Cup, and reached the conclusion that World War II may very well have stopped Sweden from becoming champions of the world. Check out that video if you haven't already. Speaking of which, the next Olympics we are examining were hosted on the other side of the Baltic Sea, in Helsinki. This is another tournament that's entirely spared from any major controversies, and fulfills all the criteria, so it's definitely eligible. Hungary were victorious by beating Romania, Italy, Turkey, Sweden and Yugoslavia, who lost another final. Ferenc Puskás later said that it was during these Olympics that their football first started to flow with real power. And you could definitely see why. It just feels right for the mighty Magyars to have at least one World Cup title. The 1960 Olympic football tournament, hosted by Italy, were won by Yugoslavia, who defeated the Azzurri in the semi-final after the drawing of lots, and triumphed over a strong Danish team in the final. The drawing of lots has never been used as a tiebreaker in a knockout match at the World Cup, but it has actually been used in the group stage in 1990. It's a very dumb tiebreaker, but FIFA makes some dumb decisions, so the tournament still can't be disqualified, especially since all the requirements are lived up to. Yugoslavia are unofficial 1960 world champions. I hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to like and subscribe.